Okay, let's go ahead and get started, and others can join us. My name is Yolanda Eisenstein, and I am writing the second edition of Careers in Animal Law, and we decided that it would be nice to have input from students and to hopefully give you some thoughts about careers as you go forward through your law school career. I am joined by Joan Schaffner, who is the Associate Professor of Law at George Washington University Law School. And Joan and I are what you would call veterans of animal law. We have been in animal law for many years. I won't say exactly how many, but what we want to do today is we want to talk about various disciplines, some case studies, some things that we hope will spark some ideas that you might not have had earlier about how you want to address your career, what you want to pursue once you get out of law school as far as animal law is given. So as we all know, animal law is very, very broad. It covers international law, federal law, state law, even indigenous and tribal law. So it's not exactly like other areas where if you want to do tax law, you know exactly where to go and what you're going to do. And that makes it a little more difficult, but also makes it more exciting, I think, in terms of pursuing a career. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about some various areas, and we want to keep this very casual. So if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand and or even put them in the chat, but we want to have an interactive session. So feel free to raise your hand, interrupt us if there's something that we're talking about that you're interested in at that moment. So you don't have to wait until the end of the session because we're going to be talking about very different things. So we'll stay on topic with that. So one of my near and dear disciplines and areas that I'm most interested in at this point in my career is international animal law. I think it's very topical. We have the UIA, which I'm involved with, is working on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which for the first time is incorporating animal welfare, including fishing. For the first time, we're seeing some recognition that the planet has finite resources, including animals. And so there's a lot of exciting things going on in the international realm, for sure. One of the big issues that I'm working on, that Joan has been working on, is illegal wildlife trafficking. And this has become an organized crime. And it's something that the United Nations and various countries that are losing their biodiversity through illegal poaching are looking at and hoping to address. And one of the case studies that we wanted to talk about was what the ABA did recently in terms of recognizing the problem and the international problem with wildlife trafficking. And so I'm going to turn it over to Joan and let her talk a little bit about this and sort of some of the things that have occurred recently related to trafficking. So I'll turn it over to you, Joan.
Thank you, Yolanda, and great to see everyone here today. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm really excited to be sharing these topics with you all. I know a few of you from GW and a few of you from elsewhere, other law schools and the like. And I believe some of you are American Bar Association members. I did want to just briefly mention the ABA. I will say that's really where, well, it's where Yolanda and I met, first of all. And when we think about your career, it is sort of one area where, you know, attorneys that are working in a variety of different areas of the law as it relates to animals come together in both the tort trial and insurance practice section, where the Animal Law Committee resides, dealing with U.S. animal law issues, and in the international law section where the International Animal Law Committee resides. And it was through the work of the IALC in the International Law section that we proposed a resolution. And just to give you a brief explanation, the American Bar Association has a House of Delegates. And the House of Delegates sets policy for the American Bar Association. And they opine on a variety of legal topics covering everything, from A to Z pretty much. And I will say that the Animal Law Committee and the International Animal Law Committee of the ABA were really established primarily to actually set policy by the ABA, to raise the visibility of non-human animals' interests within the ABA. And the best way to do that is by proposing resolutions and reports that support the resolution, presenting it to the House of Delegates, which is like 800 members from all over the country, and then having the ABA adopt these resolutions. And that has really, we've been doing this now for almost 20 years. The TIPS Animal Law Committee, it's 20-year anniversary this year. And it's really allowed for advocates, right? When the ABA takes a position on an animal law issue, it's really helpful for advocates that are advocating in the field to point to the fact that here, this huge organization, right, of attorneys that's not an animal law NGO in any regard, has actually taken a position with respect to these animal law issues. So going back to sort of this particular issue, a few years back, we drafted a resolution and report that basically urges the parties to the UN Convention Against Transnational Crime, which is called UNTOC, to add a wildlife crime protocol to that convention. And what that would allow is for much greater international cooperation and resources to actually truly enforce what has become just a huge, it's been an issue for many, many years, but it's becoming just a huge problem with wildlife poaching and trafficking internationally. And as many of you, I'm sure, know, wildlife crime is a primary driver of biodiversity loss, of species extinction, of the spread of zoonotic diseases, and it's particularly devastating to the economics and human loss at the local level in countries from where they're poaching these animals. Unfortunately, the U.S. and a lot of Western folks we're the ones that are sort of the demand for some of that supply, which is quite problematic. We're not affected in the same way here in the U.S. that the African countries and Asian countries are in terms of losing all of their wildlife through this wildlife crime. So the idea was to do that, and there's definitely, and I'll let Yolanda speak a little bit more to this as well. Since the resolution was adopted, it was adopted quite favorably by the American Bar Association, and then there are now some groups. There are groups that have been working for years, right, on wildlife trafficking and crime, that have tried to utilize that resolution and go to the UN and go to the parties of UNTOC and again try to. They've been working on this for some time, but actually we hope that the American Bar Association resolution would help promote the addition of this protocol. I'm actually not sure where it stands. I know it hasn't. We don't have a fourth protocol on wildlife crime yet, but I know that there's been discussions at the UN towards working towards that goal. Yolanda, do you know if there's been any progress that's actually been made? I know with your work, UIA and the connections there.
Yeah, actually, there has been some progress made. There's an organization called End Wildlife Crime. John Scanlon, who's working on this. I am working with Steve Richman, who actually presented, I think he presented
the resolution, yes,
the resolution to the House of Delegates to try to convince the U.S., which has not signed on to a fourth protocol, to support it. And so from a career standpoint, if this is really exciting you, these are areas where perhaps federal government work would come into play, where international law would come into play, environmental law would come into play. So these are areas, yeah. So these are kind of areas that connect to international wildlife trafficking. So, if this is something that excites you, then think about your experience, your interest, and how you could get into a certain area of law? Can you travel? Can you live in New York City, where the United Nations is? Also, nonprofit work. As I said, John Scanlon is working with a nonprofit that's trying to get the fourth protocol. So these are some areas related to illegal wildlife trafficking that might be of interest. One of the UIA members we have is Jim Karani. Jim is from Kenya. He's from Nairobi, and he's currently working on his PhD in New York. He's a lawyer. He actually goes and trains the people who go out and look for the rangers that try to catch the poachers. He works with organizations in different countries. So this is the sort of thing, if you're adventurous and you want to travel to different countries and you're interested in international law, these are just, this is just one area that might be of interest to you.
Yeah. And like I said, I mentioned the ABA because everybody isn't going to be able to necessarily get a full-time job, right, in the animal law sphere. But there's so much that you can still participate in, like on a volunteer basis through the ABA, working on these substantive. It's sort of my favorite part of what I do through the ABA is working on these substantive resolution and reports and understanding that, number one, I mean, we can also sometimes, in fact, we tried to get the ABA to do some lobbying here, and that it depends on the nature of the resolution and their resources and the like. But that is, number one way to directly influence on a lobbying level anyway, the work that's being done, but at least recognize that your work product can be used by other advocates to directly advocate on behalf. I wanted to just mention another related resolution and report that I was involved with right after, basically in 2020, in March 2020, when we all, COVID hit and everybody went virtual. We recognized in this, this concept, I mean, we really recognized at that point that the way we treat non-human animals has a direct, right, influence, and everybody saw it firsthand on public health, with of course the COVID outbreak, and of course on the environment. And that whole One Health concept has been around for a really long time, but COVID really brought it to everyone's attention. And we then used that as a vehicle to get the ABA House of Delegates to adopt a resolution and report that urges states to actually negotiate a treaty, an international treaty for the protection of animals. There is no treaty that across the board that is designed to protect animals' interests at an international level. And we got that resolution passed. And then those of us that were working on the resolution and report actually have now established an NGO. And we're now working, to try to find states that are interested in negotiating such a treaty. Again, David Favor, who is at Michigan State, he's really one of the sort of founders, if you will, of animal law here in the U.S. And a wonderful advocate. And he had the idea back in 1980, right? So it's not like it's a new idea. And he's working with us. He's on the ABA Animal Law Committee, National Animal Law Committee. He drafted the resolution report, and he's part of the group that put this together. But it takes a while, right? You have to find, from an advocate standpoint, you have to find sort of the right time and the right hook, right, to raise animals' interests, particularly at the international level, never mind at the U.S. level. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that as well. But there's a lot of great opportunities to get involved.
Absolutely. I can't say enough about what the ABA did for my career and my relationships. I mean, Joan and I met, and most of the people I still consider my animal law colleagues I met through the ABA. So another area that's a hot topic in animal law is constitutional law. And I'm sure that's not a surprise to anyone. Everything from ag-gag laws to freedom of religion to veganism. One of my most interesting topics when I was teaching was the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. The Shack 7 case and the case that followed are really rich in law and animals and advocacy and activism. So it's certainly a topic that has a rich history in animal law, and certainly one that continues to be so. I'm sure most of you know about Prop 12. This is a case of state legislation that went to litigation, that went to the Supreme Court. So it has all of the moving parts that are of interest, and I'm happy to say that there was a good outcome for us on that one. So, Joan, do you want to talk about that a bit?
Just briefly, my colleague Kathy Hessler, who of course did the first webinar. Some of you were at that session. She's on the line here with us too, and we actually, with our colleague, wrote an article about the case this past summer, published through the GW Law Review online thing. But it's, the one thing about this case is you might not think about animal law. You don't necessarily think of the Dormant Commerce Clause, right? That isn't the first thing that comes to mind. But one of the things I think that we want to get across, particularly in this session today, is while we will talk about laws that directly, right, influence and impact animals, because they regulate, right, our direct behavior and use of them. There are a lot of other, and this constitutional law is perhaps one of the primary areas in which, for example, trying to challenge ag-gag laws through the First Amendment, you might not see that as a direct, right, result on the animals. But clearly, having ag-gag laws on the books makes it much harder for advocates to find out what's going on behind the scenes and then be able to actually challenge some of those things. So the interesting thing with the Dormant Commerce Clause, right, was, and this was a very, very important case because so much of the work, particularly with respect to protecting farmed animals in the US, has taken place at the state level, right? Virtually nothing is happening at the federal level with respect to the animals' lives while they're alive, right? We have the 28-hour law. We have the, the Humane Slaughter Act, arguably humane slaughter. I don't think that makes any sense to have humane slaughter, but never mind. I go off on a tangent. But at the federal level, we basically only protect them during transport or slaughter. And so the ability of states to be able to regulate strong laws that will protect farmed animals within their state, and right, what California did that raised the Dormant Commerce Clause question, was then also say, okay, not only do California farmers have to meet these, give animals minimum, space and provide protections for them, basically outlawing the battery cages and gestation crates that are currently used by Big Ag, but they also said you can't sell your product in California unless you complied with these provisions. And most of the producers, right, were outside the state of California. And that's why there was a challenge by the National Pork Producers Council and others saying that California couldn't prohibit, right, these producers from Iowa, let's say, to actually sell their products in California, because that is, quote, a violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause, meaning it basically would provide a substantial, it had a substantial effect on interstate commerce. And the good news was that the Supreme Court disagreed with them, right, and upheld California's right to protect their own citizens, right, and to regulate, to prevent those types of products from being sold to their citizens in the state of California, which was a huge win. Now, the one thing that's happened since then is congressmen, a lot of at the federal level, right? The EATS Act is now trying to overturn the Supreme Court decision. And that's, all the advocates that I know of. And I see there's a comment in the chat. And if anybody actually would like to talk about this, there's a lot of now advocacy going on trying to prevent the EATS Act from moving forward. Because it basically would destroy the decision of the Supreme Court and basically tell states, that they can't, right, prevent the sale of those products. And that would really just result in, a race to the bottom, unfortunately, throughout the United States. Because it's pretty hard, right, if California producers have to meet certain requirements that obviously is going to impact the cost of their products. But then California is forced to bring in these products that are, that don't meet those requirements. They're going to sell at a much lower cost. And it just isn't going to be feasible. So we'll see what happens with the EATS Act. It's been around for a little while now. And if anybody, like I said, has any thoughts or knows of any where we stand, we're happy to hear from that too. I don't know, Yolanda, if you know exactly where the EATS Act stand. I know there's just a lot of advocacy going on trying to prevent it from from moving forward.
Right. And I'm not really sure what's going on at the federal level, but I will just make a comment that the Prop 12 case is playing out in New Mexico, where I live. And we had several years ago, we passed a law that designated a certain percentage of from the sale of dog food and cat food to a spay-neuter fund that would fund low-cost spay-neuter. The Pet Food Institute and a kennel club sued, and one of their arguments is that it's a violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause. So as you can see, knowing this case, you not only have national implications, but it filtered down to the states as well. And so we're in the middle of that case right now. But as you can see, there are lots of different avenues from a career with this. You've got legislation and lobbying, you've got litigation, you've got state law, you've got constitutional law. So you have all of these pieces in constitutional law that just surround that one case. So it's something to think about as you're going forward in terms of, is this something that really excites you? Do you envision yourself in the Supreme Court arguing a case? Then, this is kind of the avenue or the direction that you might want to take.
Right. A lot of NGOs are involved in that case. Also, you can either be directly involved in the litigation. You can amicus briefs. I don't even remember how many amicus briefs were involved in just that one Supreme Court case. There's so many ways, and through so many, as Yolanda said, so many different avenues for you to participate in your career in trying to promote these issues.
And I know that there are several animal law programs in law schools, GWU, which has an excellent one, along with other schools. But I think it's also important to know that if you can't go to one of these schools because you live in another state or for whatever reason, it doesn't mean that doors won't be open to you. I mean, constitutional law is taught at every law school in the country. So, there are ways that you can utilize what is being offered to advance your career and to have a career in animal law. And one of those, and this is the way most of us started in law school, there were no animal law cases, animal law classes, is through environmental law. And I think based on what I'm seeing, I'm doing a lot of international work right now. And based on what I'm seeing, given climate change, loss of biodiversity, illegal wildlife trafficking, desertification, I mean, everything that's happening to the planet right now is impacting animals as well. And so in my 20 plus years, I'm really seeing a huge overlap with environmental law and animal law now in ways that I haven't seen before. Are you seeing that, Joan?
Yes, very much so. In fact, now our new director of environmental law here at GW, Randy Abate, he really focuses a lot on the intersection between environmental and animal law. And our program, Kathy and I and Eastland, we're doing a lot of work in that area, and you're seeing it across the board. It's also a way of getting farmed animals. I mean, because so many of the uses and abuses, human abuses of animals, ultimately have an effect, right, on the environment one way or the other. It's been a huge, it's a huge way to promote animals' interests, and particularly because it's so clear to people that it also impacts humans' interests directly as well, right?
Right, and we're seeing that there was a resolution a couple of years ago at the UN that recognized the nexus between human well-being and animal well-being and the well-being of the planet. And so I think this is an area that is very much very important and will continue to be important. I don't see climate change going away anytime soon.
Right, right. I did want to mention, we have an animal welfare project at GW, although you don't really need a project to work on this. You can do it yourself as a student or as an attorney, or just as an advocate. One of the things, right, particularly in terms of environmental law, but also we'll see it in other contexts. When agencies, a variety of things happen at the agency level. And when agencies have to make certain decisions, right, there's usually a comment period. They seek public comment to inform, right, the decisions that they're going to make. And I just wanted to bring up, again, another sort of quick case study that involves the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And this was a few years ago, but it had a really happy ending. And again, it demonstrates so many different ways in which lawyers can get involved in wildlife issues and environmental issues and any issue affecting agencies. The Georgia Aquarium several years back sought a permit from NMFS, a National Marine and Fisheries Service in NOAA, to import 18 wild-caught beluga whales from Russia. Well, I'll tell you, I mean, all of the cetacean folks just went berserk because there had been actually we hadn't brought or imported wild-caught whales to the U.S. for decades. And so we got involved here at AWP, and there was a comment period, right? And there were thousands and thousands of comments that were generated in response to this request for this permit. And I will say, it involved, the MMPA is cool. I mean, it involved both the depletion of stocks in the wild with respect to these animals by removing 18 from the wild, but it also involved issues of humane treatment of the animals, because the MMPA actually does require that you have humane capture and transport, right, of the animals. And if you quite imagine, it's pretty difficult to capture and transport 18 beluga whales from Russia to Georgia here in the United States. So there were all sorts of challenges or issues that were raised under the MPA, and it was the first time, it's my understanding, the first time in the history of NMFS that they rejected the import permit, which was a wonderful thing. Then, of course, Georgia Aquarium sued. And then a variety of NGOs intervened in the case on behalf of, right, the government to help them, right, defend their decision again, in denying the permit. And that case won. So it was really sort of a great example of a huge win, but also, again, a variety of ways in which lawyers can get involved in terms of these kinds of really important decisions with respect to animals.
Yes, that was absolutely one of my very favorite cases. And I'm glad you brought that up. I know one of the issues was they were taking whales that were nursing calves, and that could not be done. And so there were just several things that in that case that you left feeling good about. So yes, I mean, this is obviously another area that is important and continues. I mean, all of the issues that we're talking about are topical. And speaking of agencies, as we all know, the Supreme Court is looking at Chevron. And, this is another interesting topic as far as what's going to happen on this. I mean, I think the Supreme Court is interesting because of its makeup right now, and these cases are going to continue to come through the courts. What do you think, Joan?
Yeah, I must admit, I don't know. I mean, I'm really anxious to see what happens with the Chevron case and and of course, for those of you who, we think almost everybody's heard of the Chevron case, but it basically involves how much discretion judges must give to agency decision making when someone challenges, right, a decision that the agency makes. And under Chevron, basically, I mean, the really simple explanation of what Chevron says is if it's vague, right, if the statute is vague, and if the such that it isn't clear, right, what the answer should be, and if the agency has made a reasonable interpretation, then basically the judge should defer to the agency's decisions here. So, and the question sort of becomes, as a political matter, it really depends on the agency and the issues, whether that's good or bad, and the court, right, from a political standpoint. So if the agency, I mean, like the EPA has been doing a lot of great work, but the courts, I think, in terms of trying to promote, at least in recent years, right, since the Biden administration, but even a year or so ago, right, they basically told them they didn't have the authority to make some of the decisions that they were doing to try to protect the environment. So if you have a progressive agency, right, that's doing some really good work, and you have a court that's not necessarily perhaps willing to be as aggressive, I should say progressive, or is more concerned about maybe the economic impact on industry as a result of some of these regulations, and they overturn the agency's decisions, it's not going to look good, right, for the climate or for animals. The USDA is, of course, the agency that oversees and administers the Animal Welfare Act. And they've not been particularly progressive over the years. So I'm not sure that I want judges necessarily deferring to their decisions. But as a political matter, it could really go either way. But it will be very interesting to see what the court says with respect to this, because it will change. It's a huge question with respect to separation of powers, and just whether the executive branch, through the agencies and the president, of course, what type of authority they have vis-a-vis the courts and, of course, Congress. And like I said, as a political matter, it's all a function of who's got control of which of the three branches at any point in time, and and who should really be left with the discretion to make some of these decisions.
Mm-hmm. Right. So regardless of how the decision goes, it's going to have a significant impact on the work that we do.
Absolutely.
So
right. Yeah, across the board.
We definitely have to keep tabs on what's happening in Chevron. And I think that also brings up a point, is the more success that we've had, and I'm talking about animal advocates and animal lawyers, the greater the pushback we've gotten. Mm-hmm. And I think that there have been certainly phases of animal law. I know when Joan and I started, we were sort of pioneering new ground. There was a lot of litigation where we were losing a lot of litigation on standing. And so we've seen an evolution. We've seen a lot more advocacy. We've seen a lot more legislative work. So we've gone through a phase where we've looked at changing the laws, not only enforcing or suing to enforce. And so I think now, particularly in agriculture, we're going after and had some successes against, factory farming, and we're raising the issues. But, at the same time, they're pushing back harder. So I think you are going to have a different environment somewhat as you go forward with your career than we did in terms of dealing with these issues. And I think we're seeing this in Prop 12, which when they lost that, they're trying to get the legislature. I know that the Pet Food Institute is trying to pull regulation of pet food out of the states and to put it under the USDA. And so there's a reason they're doing that, is because they don't want to have to pay a fee and fund low-cost spay-neuter. So all of these things are happening in your world that you're going to be dealing with when you graduate and go into practice. Does anyone have any questions on international law, on wildlife? Because we're going to kind of move on to consumer and state law right now, but I did want to open it up for any questions that anyone might have about what we've talked about so far.
I have a question. Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to do the raise hand function, even though I used to.
Sure, go ahead.
Going back to the resolutions that you were discussing, and the importance of passing ABA resolutions through the House of Delegates. And this is just more generally, like, with respect to any resolution. I mean, once a resolution is passed, what kind of does it take logistically to affect change at the legislative or regulatory level?
Right. I mean, as you're right, the resolution means nothing standing alone. It's just
Right.
it's just the ABA House of Delegates saying, okay, here's our position on this issue, right? As I said, the ABA has a lobbying arm. They don't typically lobby at an international level. I know Yolanda's trying to work a little bit with them on that, but they do lobby usually more at the federal level, at the state level, although they do have a group that does both. The problem is, and as I mentioned, there are so many different issues on which the ABA opines. And I will say one of the things that we have been struggling with over the 20 years, and it's getting better, and this was the whole point, is to have the ABA recognize that animal law issues are important, right? But they're still not at the top of their list in terms of, there might be, there's literally, scores and scores of resolutions each time the House of Delegates meet, which is twice a year, once in February and again in August, on a variety, often criminal, human rights, all sorts of different issues. So I will say that we haven't had the great success we'd like to have them actively promote our resolutions from a lobbying standpoint. But, right, one of the things that we do try to do, and of course it depends on the nature of the resolution. Some of it is state, some of it's local, right? Some of it's international. It depends on what the law is and what the resolution deals with. But my point, I'm sorry, I'm being maybe a little lengthy to get to it. Even if the ABA doesn't directly lobby, right, the key that we try to do is get to the advocates, whomever they are working on these issues, so that they know that here is a resource, right, that they can use when they are directly lobbying and advocating for whatever the legal issue happens to be. And it's at least an additional sort of tool in their toolbox to persuade the folks that they're lobbying. So I will say that as a direct matter, those of us in the ABA don't often directly do the lobbying, but the resolution can be used by those that are lobbying, right, to demonstrate here is, the statement of the ABA, which we think carries quite a bit of weight in a lot of, at federal level, at Congress, and at the state levels as well. I don't know if that answers your question, but there's a lot.
It absolutely
does. Just the resolution
yeah, it does.
Doesn't mean much of anything, but its use by advocates after the fact, right, is what we think is helpful. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anyone else?
There's a question in the chat about levels of government to focus on for wildlife legislation. Well, you're right. There's both. There's federal legislation and state legislation. At the state level, and I'm not really too familiar at the state level with the wildlife stuff, it's mostly sort of hunting, trapping, and game laws, right, Yolanda? It's in terms of wildlife at the state level?
We do a lot of legislation here in New Mexico. I'm president of the board of the Animal Protection Voters of New Mexico, a 501c4. And basically we recently passed got a ban on coyote killing contest.
Right.
So that's really the sort of things, projects that we work on. We work on human animal conflicts. I have a yard full of coyotes and bears occasionally. And so this is another issue that's very important in terms of how these issues are handled. So yeah, it's really very much local, but depending on which state you live in, we have wolves here, the gray Mexican wolf, which many of you may know about. So those are the issues that we work on, probably more than companion animals, to be honest with you, because we do have major issues to deal with. And then, of course, at the federal level, you have the Endangered Species Act, the spillover with CITES and trade. And so, yeah, there are actually, two levels. If you want to facilitate change, I would say at the state level, that probably is where the most opportunity is, depending which state you're in. So I think if it's something that you're interested in terms of passing legislation, look at the issues that are in your state where you're living or where you plan to live when you graduate and practice. And that will give you an idea of what opportunities are there. But we do a lot of wildlife work here in New Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a great question, and you're noting, right, the different, where does Congress get their power? Either through the Interstate Commerce Clause, right, or their treaty power, right? So you're right. Many of these issues are state level issues because of the state powers that the states retain, and it just, like I said, it just depends on what the particular issue happens to be about. I mean, and the other thing, just from a political matter, right, as Yolanda said, and as we all know, there's, we have 50 different states in the District of Columbia, as well as other, right, groups. I mean, and they're all politically in very different places. So you can often get, depending upon where you live, right, get something passed through the state much more easily than you might getting passed through the federal government, right? Just as a political matter. But that, again, depends on what state you're talking about and what the issue happens to be.
Right. Okay, so let's move to companion animals in the time that we have left. And this is interesting because, as we all know, animals are considered property, but there has been progress made, and a couple of instances include pet trust. Because if you think about it, in all of the states now, you can make provisions in your will for the care of an animal if you die before the animal does. And this means the animal is a beneficiary, and that is not property. You cannot set up a trust for your automobile or your television set, but you can for your animal. So I think it's important to see and recognize what's happening at the level of the states. The other area that's very interesting is we're seeing a shift in how judges view animals in custody cases, where you have splits of partnerships or divorces. So judges are starting to look, and I think, Jonah, there may be 3 states that now tell judges that they either have to or they have the discretion to do a best interest analysis when deciding where the animal should go.
Yeah, at least 3 states, now 6. Okay, Kathy said 6. And DC, we just passed that provision. And again, our Animal Welfare Project was involved in drafting the legislation that we got through DC Council and was actually formally enacted last year in 2023. That basically just grants, right, judges the authority to take the best interest of the animals into account. It doesn't force them to do so. The judge still has discretion, but it's a huge step. It's a huge step forward. And both of these, to some degree, and I know, here in the United States, I guess our companion animals probably have the most protections under the law, right, than any other animals used in research or for food or wildlife. And I know a lot of people are more interested in looking at those other animals, partly because, number one, I mean, the billions, right, of farmed animals that have basically no protection and are being slaughtered daily, it sounds much more, problematic than our companion animals to some degree. But, the hope too is that as we make the companion animal, I think, because of, at least in this country, the way we view our companion animals, we're able to perhaps politically make more progress in the area of companion animals, with the hope, right, that you start recognizing, gee, if you see your dog and your cat this way, the pigs and the chickens and the cows, they're really not that much different. Why do we treat them differently? And so I think our hope is that, as the law starts creating these sort of areas in which we're not viewing animals purely as property, by allowing judges to take their best interest into account in custody, or by granting them beneficiary status under a trust, that's eventually, over time, right, going to completely change the way, the law views non-human animals across the board. So I do think it's a really important progress. And I'll have to say, some of you know me, I have a feline sanctuary. That's why I've got all my pictures of my original 4 cats and 5 cats there behind me. Several of the guys in my sanctuary, are here because their human, guardian or owner did not provide in their will or a trust for them. And that is such a huge issue within our companion animal area, is that people die and they don't think, right, that they have to have a provision for their animal. And often the animals have been with them for years. They're much older. They may have health issues. They go to a shelter. they're not going to be adopted often, and they may just be killed. And so this is something, no matter kind of what, a family law practice, any type of practice, you can talk to folks and say, if you have a companion animal, you really need to provide for them, because it really is an important legal consideration, I think, just across the board with anyone you're talking about, even if you're talking to your friends and your own family, right? It took me a while to finally put a trust together for my guys. We don't like to think about dying or being disabled, but it's a huge, horses too, right? I'm saying any animal that is under your care, you really need to provide for them.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ideas that I've had is actually setting up a retirement home for animals, where you would have a facility that people would, set up a pet trust, and, you would be the person to take care of these animals in their retirement, and it would be funded by, the person. They would have to have a certain amount of money that they would donate to the facility. And so I just, there are certain opportunities, I think, going forward, as we have greater and greater care and the ability legally to take care of our animals, as opposed to just, putting them to sleep. I mean, there was, what was that famous case about euthanasia for putting the animals down, the Bricklin and the Irish setters?
I'm forgetting that. Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, there was it's one of the cases I taught, and the woman who died had it in her will that her dogs should be put to sleep.
Yeah.
When she died, and the caretaker at her house wanted the dogs, and so the executor, a wonderful executor, challenged the will because he didn't want to put the dogs down. And it had a happy ending because the caretaker, who loved the dogs and had lived with the dogs, the judge gave him the dogs, and they lived happily ever after. And so there are a lot of interesting cases and interesting work to be done in wills and trust and family law. So maybe you don't have an animal law practice, but if you go into family law or other areas of the law, there are always opportunities for you to do animal law cases and eventually decide if you would like to have your own practice. So I think it's certainly something to think about as you go forward.
I'll just jump here, and I see it
sure.
quickly in the chat. Kathy Hessler mentioned the domestic violence protection orders, and that raises a bigger issue, that's related directly to criminal law and the protection of our companion animals through our criminal statutes, and family abuse and violence, right? I think everyone has probably heard of this. We call it the link, right? It's the link between abuse of animals and abuse of humans, whether it be within your family or otherwise. And that's been, that's the scientists have recognized that for a long time, and it took the law quite a long time to catch up. But now, as was mentioned, number one, this is a huge connection with domestic violence. I know many of you may be interested in domestic violence issues and the like, because that's a huge question. And of course, one of the problems is usually the abuser uses the animal, right, to harm their partner or the like. And so that prevents people from leaving a domestic violence situation if there's no place for them to bring their pet. Or to be able to have a protective order that would actually encompass the protection of the animal. So that's, as 10 states don't allow it. Like I said, I know years ago we got that passed here in DC, and it's a huge benefit to everyone. But again, the intersections that we have, with animal law and all these other areas of the law is huge. And so it's almost impossible to not find an area of the law where you won't be, no matter what your practice is, where you could then bring in an animal law component, right, one way or the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Here in New Mexico right now, in the next legislative session, the family law practitioners are looking at overhauling their entire code at the next section, and this gives us a chance to collaborate with them. And so we're working with them to make sure that animals are considered in areas such as custody cases and in domestic violence cases. So I think family law certainly is one of those areas that you can make a meaningful contribution to animal protection if
Right.
you're not, yeah.
There's also landlord-tenant.
Mhm.
Again, we're working on a bill right now that we think it's going to be introduced on March 12th here in DC. That is going to make it much more affordable for people with pets, right, to get housing because DC is not the most friendly place. There's a lot of no pets clauses in a lot of these contracts, and when there isn't, they charge you an arm and a leg, right, to have an animal, a companion animal. So this is, becoming. I think Colorado has recently passed a similar bill, and the idea is to basically limit, right, what kinds of fees they can charge, both what kinds of fees and how much they can be, whether it be rental or move-in fees and those sorts of things, and particularly importantly, not allow breed discrimination. Breed discrimination has been an issue within the advocacy world for animals for a long, long time. Many dangerous dog laws used to basically just say if you're if you're this breed, you're by definition dangerous. And some jurisdictions, unfortunately, still do ban certain types of dogs based on breed. But we all recognize it isn't a function primarily of breed; it's a function of how you've been trained and your and in your care. So that's another thing. Housing, both and in terms of insurance, right? A lot of homeowners insurance companies won't insure, right, you if you have a certain breed of animal. So there's been a lot of work in that area, right, to not allow that type of breed discrimination, because it doesn't go to anyone's benefit, because humans are not better off because we don't have pit bulls around. We're better off if we don't have, animals who are truly not, dangerous because they were likely abused by their owners. Anyway.
Right. Okay, so we have a few minutes left, and we'll just cover one last topic, which is animals in entertainment and sport. This is obviously still an issue. We still have SeaWorlds and zoos and rodeos and bullfights. And so this is another issue that is still topical and something that I think is very important for those of us in animal protection to address. We had the Ringling Brothers case that went on for many, many years and took lots of twists and turns. And then we also had the sad case of Lolita, the orca whale, who spent her whole life in a tank. So why don't you talk a little bit about these issues in the last few minutes that we have, Joan?
Yeah, the Ringling Brothers case, interestingly, that was a private law firm here, Meyer, Lichtenstein, and Crystal, that took that case. So this wasn't, a big, like PETA. I mean, PETA has done some of the cases with Lolita and the like. But you can have a private practice that does address some of these, some people think of the private practice as mostly companion animal related, but private practice practitioners can also get involved with, with entertainment and wildlife and environmental issues as well. And they were the ones leading the Ringling Brothers case. It was a great case. And I mean, technically, they lost the case. But basically, Ringling Brothers isn't using their Asian elephants anymore, right? And in fact, I don't think they're using any animals at all. So to me, that was one of the biggest wins indirectly
Absolutely.
we got.
Yeah, it's a case of losing the battle but winning the war.
For the war, right? I mean, usually it's maybe the other way around, but it was really really great. And it was also, it was an interesting case study in terms of the standing issue you mentioned, Yolanda. They used the Asian elephants. The reason they were able to file lawsuit, because many of you know that the Animal Welfare Act does not have a private cause of action, but the Endangered Species Act does. So a private person, can try to enforce the ESA, but you can't enforce the AWA. Well, of course, captive animals are really protected under the AWA, but the Asian elephants that they were using were listed as endangered, even though they were here, they were obviously being used for entertainment. And so you can combine, you use the ESA as a means of getting in the door and having standing. And then, of course, you challenge their care under the AWA as basically a violation of the ESA. So it's kind of an interesting, and this is the other thing about animal law, right? You have to be creative. You've got to, we have what we have, and you've got to come up with ways to figure out how you can, try to protect animals' interests given what we do have. Of course, the lobbyists are working on changing some of that, but from a litigation standpoint, you have to work with the tools that you have. So that was a great case. And the Lolita case, again, it demonstrates there were a couple of different ways in which advocates were attempting to get protection for Lolita. One mechanism, again, was through agency work, right? When the agency is supposed to, basically they have permits, right, for the use of these animals, and they have to be re-permitted every few years. And it was clear, or it seemed clear anyway to the advocates, that they were violating several provisions of the AWA. Nevertheless, Miami Seaquarium was continued to get their permit. So they challenged the agency's decision to permit, right, to extend the permit on Seaquarium, which got around the private cause of action problem under the AWA. So that was sort of the first hook, right, that either as an NGO and or private litigation, you can sort of get in and challenge what's being done. But then several years later, actually Lolita was added as an endangered species under the Endangered Species Act. And then, of course, they could use many of the same mechanisms they did for Reeling Brothers as a means of challenging the protection for Lolita. But that's, one of the biggest issues is, again, I think you all know, no matter how great the laws are on the books, if they're not enforced, they're not very useful. And so, that's where, like I said, primarily the litigators of the world come into play, trying to see, even if the laws aren't perfect, they're better than nothing, but someone has to enforce them. And the USDA doesn't have a great track record in enforcement.
Very true. Very true.
But these are ways in which we as advocates can try to push the ball forward.
Great. So we have a couple of minutes left. I hope that Joan and I have given you some things to think about, whether it's areas of law that you're interested in, whether it's litigation or lobbying that you're interested in. Just, being creative, thinking about ways that you can take your area of expertise, what you're interested in your education forward for animals, whether it be a full-time job or even doing it as on a pro bono basis or as part of your practice. So there are lots of opportunities out there. I put my email in the chat box. I'm always happy to talk to students and talk to people who love to talk about animal law, and so I am certainly available. And our next session will be in April. We don't have a date yet, but stay tuned. We'll have another session on careers in animal law. And Joan, thank you so much for joining me on this, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you for having me. These are a great series, and I'm really hoping that you all stay with us through the series because there's a lot to learn about careers in animal law. And thank you, Yolanda, for rewriting this book. The first one was great.
I'm working on it.
Was great, and the second one's going to be even better.
That's right. You're helping me write it. So thanks again. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.